War, Roman numeral 7. Hitler decided to break all of the agreements of the Munich Conference and invade all of Czechoslovakia. Pretty much by doing this, he knows that the British and the French are probably going to end up going to war with him. His hope was that he could conquer as much land as possible before they could organize themselves. Recognizing his failure to adhere to the conference, British and the French agreed to war with Germany, but only again if they invaded one more spot, that would be Poland. And so they looked at that and they were trying to decide whether or not they wanted to invade Poland. They also hoped the Russians would help them, seeing that communism and fascism and socialism were opposites. This thought was put to rest as Russia and Germany signed a non-aggression pact and agreed to divide up Poland after they invaded it. By the time the Germans and the Russians had decided to come to this agreement, this freaked us out a little bit because these are two, again, world powers that could work together to dominate all of Europe and probably most, if not all, of Asia. As well as we kind of considered Russia to be quote-unquote friends, but that didn't necessarily pan out the way that we were hoping as well either. That said, this whole idea of them becoming friends and signing this non-aggression pact really threw us off, and it really stinks for poor Poland who's stuck in the middle. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler decides to invade Poland, and keeping their pledge, the French and the British declare war on Germany. Now, Germany's allies, the Japanese and the Italians, followed suit by declaring war on the British and the French, and World War II is officially underway. Now, Blitzkrieg was going to be the main method of attack by the Germans as they decide that they're going to attack the British and the French. The idea behind this was fast, concentrated areas of fighting, and it would help them conquer many countries in Europe in a relatively short period of time. And again, the thought was if you can control all of this land prior to the French and the British being organized, then by the time they do get organized, it's not really going to matter. And so Blitzkrieg was their main method of attack. Lots of troops, lots of airplanes, lots of tanks concentrated in one area, focused, and deciding to destroy those areas. So the change of U.S. policy, once war began, we felt like our best chance was to stay out of the war and was to assist the British and the French as they fought the Germans. See, we didn't really want to go to war, but we felt like if we could help our allies out, that would then involve them being able to actually survive long enough, maybe even win the war without us. And FDR and Churchill became very good friends, and that was a key to the victory in World War II. Those two and their relationship was a great relationship. And we decided to pass a policy called the cash and carry policy, which we would only help the British. Obviously, the French were there, but the French were pretty much controlled by the Germans at this point in time. And allow us to sell arms to other countries, but they had to pay cash, and they had to transport the weapons themselves. And that was kind of the idea behind cash and carry policy, pretty self-explanatory. The idea behind this is that we wouldn't risk American lives in the open waters, but we'd still be able to make money off of this. The Selective Service Act was passed in 1940. Again, America's still not in the war yet. And registration of all men ages 21 to 35 had to register for possibly going to war, and this was the first time we had a peacetime draft in American history, meaning we weren't technically at war, and then we wanted to get a draft going. See, in World War I, we were already in the war, and therefore they started to do the conscription itself. We actually didn't have a ton of volunteers right at first, but as more things start being destroyed that are Americans, that kind of changes our tune a little bit. We traded destroyer ships for the right to build military bases on some islands that British own in the Caribbean. Basically, kind of like the idea behind what we call the Lend-Lease Act, where we would lend them things and lease them things. But you guys know how this goes. If you're lending someone a battleship, you're pretty much planning on it not coming back. The election of 1940, the big question was FDR going to break the tradition of two terms? And after many ambiguous answers, meaning unclear answers, he finally stated that he would run again as president. He did so telling the American people that he would not be sending our men into war. And technically, same type of thing with Woodrow Wilson. We weren't in war, but they both pretty much knew we were going to go to war in one way, shape, or form. But again, the big thing is he's running for a third term, and he's probably, as many people are looking at this, going to win. Why? The Great Depression's almost over, but we're on the cusp of war. And so people are kind of like thinking, do we really want to change who our leader is? Wendell Willkie was the Republican whose strongest criticism of FDR was his decision to break the two-term tradition established by George Washington back in the 1780s. You're going to need to bring more fire than that, Wendell. And he didn't really, wasn't able to do that. The results, FDR won with 54% of the popular vote. The reasons he probably won: the economy was recovering as we prepared for possible war, and the fear of going to war with an inexperienced leader was not something Americans liked. He told everybody that he was going to be sending an arsenal of democracy. And it was in a speech called the Four Freedoms speech that FDR gave a speech that proposed sending money to the British, arguing that the U.S. must help other nations defend the freedom of speech, religion, and freedom from want and freedom from fear. And again, this is called the Four Freedoms speech. Very famous speech that came out of this, and sending an arsenal of democracy. And that's when he passed the Lend-Lease Act, where FDR proposed ending the cash and carry policy and allowing the British to obtain what they needed from us on credit, meaning they wouldn't pay full price. Isolationists would deplore this action, meaning if you're doing this, you are no longer an isolationist at all. The Lend-Lease Act was signed into law by March of 1941, and that allows us to give them what they need. During this time, FDR and Churchill meet in Newfoundland, which is off the coast near kind of like Nova Scotia area, and they drew up what they called the Atlantic Charter. And this stated that the general principles for peace after the war would include self-determination for all people, meaning they could decide for themselves what type of government they wanted, no territorial expansion, meaning British didn't want to gain any territory, the Americans didn't want to gain any territory, and then also free trade, which was something we've been talking about for seemingly forever. But more importantly, this is more of a symbolic meeting. It's a symbolic meeting because what it's doing is finally putting the British and the Americans together on the same page, saying we're going to work together for good. After one of our ships, the Greer, was attacked by a German sub, Franklin Roosevelt ordered all Navy ships to shoot on sight. The beginning of the undeclared war on Germany had happened. Japan, their invasion of neighboring China, meant the violation of the open door policy, and their alliance with Germany and Italy created more strain between us. The U.S. started to use trade embargoes against them, hoping it would change their tune, hoping it would make them realize they needed the Americans badly. And trade embargoes a lot of times does a pretty good job of getting people because it hurts their pocketbook. Hideki Tojo and FDR tried negotiating a treaty, but neither side was willing to change much of their position. So, secretly, both sides are preparing for war against each other. Well, that comes down to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. And again, when you think about Pearl Harbor, the question is, was it really a surprise? Did we really know that it was coming? This is where the conspiracy theorists love to have their kind of their day. Now, is it true that we knew that there was an attack? We knew there was an attack that was going to be inevitable, and we pretty much assumed it was going to be the Pacific. However, we kind of told San Francisco to be on high alert, LA to be on high alert. We did tell Hawaii to be on high alert and all of our islands, but we really didn't respect them as pilots. We didn't think that they had the guts. We didn't think they were that good of flyers in order to make it all the way across. And so when it comes down to it, this did seemingly was a surprise attack, but when you hear the stories about the guys that knew and saw the radar and kind of saw something coming in, but it was a huge fleet of our ships, so we didn't really put much stock into it, there's just enough that seems fishy. Now, am I one of those people that believe that FDR knew that the attack at Pearl Harbor was going to happen and was willing to sacrifice American lives just to get us involved in World War II? I would not quite go that far. At least not I wouldn't. Will I say that it did seem a little bit weird that we kind of lined up all of our boats in one spot and our airplanes in one spot? That would make it very easy to have target practice. I do think that's a little bit weird. But again, I don't truly believe there's a conspiracy theory behind this. Anyway, the attack lasted about 2 hours. It was on a Sunday morning, killed over 2,400. Many warships were sunk and damaged along with a lot of our airplanes. The big thing was our aircraft carriers were actually out at sea. and that made it a little bit more feasible for us to continue to fight the war. That said, a lot of those 2,400 that were killed were on one battleship. Hundreds were actually on one battleship that actually went down. This is where FDR gives his famous speech, "A day that will live in infamy." We declared war on Japan, and their allies followed suit on us. And secretly, Britain and France are pretty excited about this because why? Well, we're now involved in World War II. Germany, Hitler broke his non-aggression pact with the Russians and invaded them in December of 1941, mainly because he felt like he had conquered as much as he needed to and felt, hey, maybe we could go ahead and go after them. From 1942 to 1945, the forces fighting Germany were the British, the United States, and the Russians. Wait a second, what about France? You have to understand France is pretty much taken over at this point in time, hence the movie Dunkirk. That's that final fight that they had in World War II. The forces agreed to focus on Hitler first, and then concentrate their forces on Japan. Though the Americans did more of the splitting of their forces than the others did, America sent a lot of people to Japan to start the fighting there. The main groups that were fighting in Japan were the Marines. The Army and the Air Force, which wasn't really technically created yet, but the Army and the Navy were in the British area, but mainly the Marines and the Navy were in Japan area because of the amphibious type invasions that we would have to be going from land to sea. And so anyway, we did kind of fight a two-front war. We did not know which one was going to be the easier one, but as you move forward, you have to think of it like this. We are looking at fighting the Japanese. We would frequently say we're fighting the Japanese in Asia, but we're fighting the Nazis in Europe. We would rarely say fighting Germany. It was more fighting a political party, and then the people that we were fighting in Japan, that's what we would say. And that was kind of a big deal because it just kind of showed people that we were not very happy with how the Japanese dealt with things, and revenge was on our mind. That's it for chapters 37 and 38. We'll pick up on 39 later.